Welcome to Module 2 of the Introduction to Organic Dairy Production. This module is on the National Organic Standards. My name is Sarah Flack, and I'm a consultant specializing in organic certification and grass-based livestock production systems. The goal for this module is to present an overview of the National Organic Program's organic standards. This is only going to be a summary of these standards, with an emphasis on the sections that are related to livestock production systems. Since this is just a summary, you should go and read the full regulatory text, which can be found at this link. What we are going to cover in this module is the Organic Program Standards Subpart A, which is definitions, Subpart B, which is applicability, who has to get certified, and Subpart C, which is the detail of the organic production and handling requirements. And then we will also present an overview of the national list of allowed and of prohibited materials. This is the list of reading which is required before you go through this Module 2. This is the table of contents of the National Organic Program Standards. The sections that we will be covering in this module are highlighted in green. The sections that we will not be covering in much detail at all are in black. This is the table of contents continued. You can see that there are a significant number of sections that we will not be covering in this module. Starting with Subpart A, definitions. This is section 205.1 and 205.2. This is just an example of one of the many terms which are defined in this Subpart A. This is the definition of the word crop, which goes into detail to say that crop are pastures, cover crops, green manure crops, catch crops, or any plant or part of a plant intended to be marketed as an agricultural product, fed to livestock, or used in the field to manage nutrients and soil fertility. We're not going to go through any of the other terms that are defined in this section, but many of these terms are important to know ahead of time before you start reading the organic standards, since they are referred to in many sections in the organic standards. So we're going to move right on to Subpart B, which is applicability. This is 205.100, which is what has to be certified. Basically, all organic production and handling operations have to be certified unless they fit into one of the exemptions or exclusions from certification. And this section also goes on to detail that you may face civil action or be fined if you knowingly sell a product as organic which does not comply with the National Organic Program standards. 205.101 are the exemptions and exclusions from certification, and this is producers or handlers who sell less than $5,000 a year of organic product. However, within this exemption, these products that are sold under this $5,000 exemption cannot be used as an organic ingredient in processed food products, and most importantly to this module, these exempt products may not be used as organic feed by certified organic livestock producers. This is really just an exemption that usually applies to backyard farmers or small gardeners who are selling product at the farmer's market or a roadside stand. Additional exemptions are processors that are producing products that have less than 70% organic ingredients and are limiting the type of label claims that they are making. The other requirement of these exempt and excluded producers is that they still have to keep the records to track the organic ingredients and verify the quantities that are made. Moving on to 205.102, this is the use of the term organic. There are three different categories of organic product: 100% organic, organic, and made with organic ingredients. 205.103 details some of the record keeping that is required to be kept by certified operations. And again, this is just a summary, so it's important to look at all of the different sections of the organic standards that require different types of records to be kept by farms and processors. In general, these records must fully disclose all activities and transactions. They have to demonstrate compliance with the organic standards, and they have to be kept for at least 5 years and available at the annual inspection, and also be available anytime there might be an unannounced inspection. 205-105 starts to detail some of the information on the organic standards of allowed and prohibited substances, methods, and ingredients in organic production and handling. The way the organic standards work is that synthetic substances are prohibited for use in crop and livestock production unless they are specifically allowed on the national list. Meanwhile, the natural substances, or the non-synthetic substances, are all allowed for use in crop and livestock production unless they are specifically prohibited on the national list. We'll go into detail on the national list later in this module. Some more important detail in 205-105 is that there are 3 materials which are prohibited. These include genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, ionizing radiation or irradiation, and sewage sludge. All 3 of those types of practices or materials are prohibited. We're now going to move into Subpart C, the organic production and handling requirements. Again, in this section, we are just going to be summarizing the organic standards, so it's important to go and read the full set of organic text and rules. This section states in 205-200 that the production practices must maintain or improve the natural resources of the operation, including soil and water quality. 205-201 details the requirement of the organic production and handling system plans. An organic system plan, or OSP, is generally referred to as the application by most farmers. It's the application that they fill out once a year and submit to their certifier. These must be approved by the certifier, and they need to detail the practices and procedures on the farm. They need to list all of the materials to be used on livestock, on the land, in products to be made, and in the facilities. They need to describe the monitoring practices used to evaluate the effectiveness of the organic plan. And they need to describe the record-keeping system used by the operation, and describe how the operation will prevent commingling or contamination of organic food products with either non-organic materials or prohibited materials. In addition, certifying agents may require additional items to be included in the plan in order to be able to verify if the operation is meeting the organic requirements. We're now going to move into section 205-202. This is the crop production and land requirements. It first requires that land must have been managed in accordance with section 202 through 206, which we'll go into some more detail next. It states that land must not have had any prohibited substances applied within 3 years of the harvest of an organic crop. So that is where the requirement for a 3-year transition for the land is stated. It goes on to state that fields must have distinct defined boundaries and buffer zones to prevent contamination coming from adjoining land. Moving into 205-203, Soil Fertility and Crop Nutrient Management Practice Standard. Farms must select and implement practices that maintain or improve soil quality and minimize soil erosion. And farms are required to rotate their crops, required to plant cover crops, and use plant and animal materials to maintain or improve soil organic matter content in a manner that does not contaminate crops, soil, or water. This section will be less important to livestock producers, but if a farm is growing crops which are intended for human consumption, there are some additional restrictions on the use of manure and a specific definition for compost if it is being used on crops for human consumption. 205-203 also specifies that mined materials are allowed as soil amendments. There are some additional restrictions for some mined natural materials of high solubility, and those are detailed either in 203 or in the national list. Synthetic fertility inputs which are on the national list are allowed. Again, there are restrictions on some of these. And synthetic fertilizers are not allowed unless they're on the national list, and sewage sludge is always prohibited. 205-204 details the requirements for seeds and planting stock. And the sections of this part which are going to apply to dairy farms or livestock operations are that organic seeds are required. There's an exemption to this in that if the variety or the quantity of seed that a farm wants to use is not available organically, then they are allowed to use a non-organic seed. However, those seeds cannot be treated with a prohibited substance such as a fungicide. And in addition, if non-organic seed has to be purchased, it cannot be genetically engineered, and so proof that it was non-GMO seed will also be required. Section 205 goes into the requirement for the crop rotation. This applies to annual crops. It is not required to rotate perennial crops, such as a perennial pasture. But annual crops must be rotated in order to maintain and improve soil organic matter, to provide pest management, manage nutrients, and to provide erosion control. Moving on to section 206, crop, pest, weed, and disease management practice standard. In this section, it describes that producers must use practices to prevent crop pests, weeds, and diseases, and that these practices can include crop rotation, nutrient management, sanitation measures. And then going into more detail, for insects, they may be controlled by beneficial insect release, natural habitat enhancement of the beneficial insects, and also by the use of lures, traps, and repellents. Continuing on in 205-206, looking at weeds. Weeds may be controlled by mulching with biodegradable materials. They may be controlled by mowing, grazing, mechanical cultivation, hand weeding, and also flame, electrical, or heat treatments. Continuing on in 205-206, biological or botanical substances or materials which are on the national list may be used, but only if preventative practices were used and they were found to not be adequate to prevent or control the pests or weeds or diseases. In addition, this section states that producers must not use lumber treated with prohibited substances for new installations or replacement purposes if it comes in direct contact with the soil or livestock. Moving into the next section, which is 205-207, this is the detail on wild crop harvesting, which generally isn't going to apply to a dairy farm. We're going to skip over several sections of the organic standards here and move right into 205-236, which is the origin of livestock. This section has different requirements for the transition and certification of animals for meat versus animals for milk production. This is going to be just a summary of the origin of livestock requirements. This is a section you'll want to study in more detail. But in general, poultry must be under organic management since the second day of life, and this would be for both egg production and for meat chickens. Slaughter stock must be under organic management since the last third of its gestation. Moving on to dairy animals. Dairy animals must be under organic management for at least a year prior to the production of milk. So that's the transition requirement. During that transition year, farmers may feed farm-raised third-year transitional feed and forages in that transition year for the livestock, and only using feed produced on their own farm that is third-year transition. The Origin of Livestock section also requires that livestock producers maintain records that verify the identity of all of the organic animals and all of the products from those animals. Again, that's a section that should be studied in more detail, both for the transition process and for the renewal certification process for farms once they're already certified. We're going to move now into section 205-237 on livestock feed. This requires that all organic livestock must be fed only organic feed. The organic feed may contain feed additives and feed supplements that are either non-synthetic or natural, or that are synthetic only if those synthetics are on the national list. It requires that all agricultural ingredients in any feed supplements must be certified organic. It prohibits the use of animal drugs to promote growth, and prohibits feed containing urea, manure, or any mammalian or poultry slaughter byproducts. It also prohibits the use of plastic pellets. Continuing on in the livestock feed section, ruminants must be actively getting feed grazed from pasture during the grazing season, unless some of the exemptions apply. We'll get into those exemptions later. But this section requires that no more than 70% of ruminants' dry matter demand can come from dry matter fed, which is the non-pasture dry matter. This is calculated as an average over the entire grazing season. One of the exempt groups from this pasture requirement are breeding bulls. Going into some more of the detail in the livestock feed section, this is the record-keeping requirement. Records are required to be kept of the total feed ration for each type of animal. A record of all purchased and farm-raised feed must be kept. Record of the quantity of each type of feed in the ration, and a list of all of the feed supplements used must be kept. And then a record also has to be kept of the actual amount of each type of feed that was fed to each group of animals. And then ration change records, which are each time the ration significantly changes during the grazing season, must be kept. And then also the method being used on the farm to calculate both dry matter demand and dry matter intake from pasture. There's a significant amount of more information in section 237 on feed that you should look at more closely, but we're now going to move into section 205-238 on livestock health care. This section requires that organic livestock producers have a preventative health care plan, and that the practices in that plan can include selection of suitable species and breeds, balanced nutrition, appropriate housing, pasture and sanitation, exercise. Animals have to have freedom of movement, and stress reduction. Physical alterations are allowed to promote the animal's welfare if they're done in a manner that minimizes pain and stress. Vaccines and veterinary biologics are allowed. This livestock healthcare section states that when preventative practices are not adequate to prevent sickness, then producers may use medications that are either non-synthetic, the natural ones, or are synthetic, as long as those synthetics are on the national list of approved materials. It also says in this section that it is prohibited to withhold medical treatment from a sick animal in order to try to just preserve its organic status. Livestock healthcare practice standard allows synthetic internal parasiticides, which are on the national list, to be used, but only in specific situations. It can be used on breeder stock prior to the last third of gestation, can be used in dairy stock, but then there is a 90-day milk withholding, and it can only be used when preventative measures have failed. It cannot ever be used on slaughter stock, so this is another place in the organic standards where there's a difference between the organic standards for meat and for dairy. This healthcare practice standard also prohibits antibiotics and breeding hormones, and it also prohibits the use of any drugs in the absence of illness. We're now going to move into Section 205-239, which is livestock living conditions. The organic standards require year-round living conditions which accommodate the health and natural behavior of the livestock. This includes year-round access to the outdoors, to shade, shelter, fresh air, clean drinking water, and direct sunlight. Animals may be temporarily denied access to the outdoors if the exemptions later in this section apply. Continuing on with 205-237, livestock living conditions. Yards and feeding pads may be used to provide outdoor access during the non-grazing season, and also may be used to provide supplemental feeding during the grazing season. Daily grazing throughout the grazing season is required unless some of these exemptions that we'll talk about next apply. This section also requires clean, dry bedding and specifically states that any roughages used as bedding must be organic. So if somebody is using rice hulls or straw or corn stubble, that would have to be certified organic bedding. These are some of the exemptions specified in 205-239 when temporary confinement or shelter is allowed. Many of the terms in here are referred to in more detail in the definitions section in the beginning of the organic standards. Temporary confinement is allowed due to inclement weather, stage of life, though the standards state that lactation is not a stage of life. It's allowed anytime there are conditions which would jeopardize the health, safety, or well-being of the animal. Confinement is allowed for preventative health care, treatments, and also the treatment of illness or injury in livestock. It's allowed for shipping or sorting of livestock and for breeding. 205-239, continuing the exemptions. Temporary confinement is allowed when there are fairs or other events, 1 week at drying off of an animal, and 3 weeks prior to calving. The exemptions are allowed for newborn dairy cattle up to 6 months of age. There's an exemption to keep the animals in during shearing of fiber animals and milking of dairy animals. And then there's also an exemption for the finishing of slaughter stock. There's a lot more detail in that section of the organic standards on those exemptions. This is just a summary of the exemptions. We're now going to go over section 205-240, which is the pasture practice standard. This section requires a grazing plan or pasture plan, and that plan must be included in the OSP, or the Organic System Plan, and this grazing plan has to be kept up to date. The plan needs to include a description of the types of pasture, of the management practices that are going to be used to ensure that pasture of sufficient quality and quantity is available to graze throughout the grazing season. It requires a description of the length of the grazing season and the location and size of the pasture, including pasture maps. The pasture plan must also include the description of the type of grazing method to be used, the location and types of fences, locations of shade, and water. You don't have to include the location of temporary fences, just permanent fences. It also needs to include a description of the soil fertility and the seeding system, and what methods are in use to control erosion and protect wetlands and riparian areas. Section 205-240 also goes on to say that pasture must be managed as a crop and that irrigation shall be used as needed. Pasture must be managed to provide at least 30% of the dry matter intake on average over the course of the grazing season. Pasture must also be managed to minimize the occurrence and spread of disease and parasites, and the pasture management system must not put soil or water quality at risk. These are some of the additional sections in the organic standards that we're not going to cover today. Section 205-270 goes into the detail of processed products. 205-271 goes into facility pest management. 205-272 has detail on commingling and contact with prohibited substances. And then 205-290 details what temporary variances are, and this is important for producers to know in case of a flood or drought or another natural disaster. This is the process by which the farm's certifier can request a temporary variance of part of the organic standards. Again, these are some additional sections that we're not going to go over in detail in this module. Subpart D is on labeling. Subpart E is on certification, and this will be covered in Module 10 in more detail. This describes the certification process, including the organic inspection process. We're now going to move into looking at the section of the organic standards, which is the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. Non-synthetic or natural substances are allowed unless they are specifically prohibited in the organic standards. All synthetic substances are prohibited in organic production unless they are specifically allowed and on the national list. The national list is found in 205-601, which is the synthetic substances allowed for use in organic crop production. And you'll see as we go through this, the national list is broken down into separate sections for crop, livestock, and processed products. The full list is available on the USDA NOP website. Looking at some of the synthetics which are allowed in crop production, these include algicides, disinfectants, some sanitizers including ethanol, chlorine, and hydrogen peroxide. There are some soap-based herbicides which are allowed. Insecticides, including insecticidal soap, some horticultural oils are allowed. Soil amendments, including micronutrients, liquid fish products, and aqueous plant extracts are allowed. It's important to note that many of these substances are subject to additional restrictions, which limit how they are used or how much is allowed to be used. We're now going to look at 205-602, which are the non-synthetic substances which are prohibited for use in organic crop production. So these are natural substances which may not be used, and they include ash from manure burning. Sodium nitrate will be taken off the allowed list and put on the prohibited list after October of 2012. Strychnine and tobacco dust are also prohibited. So now we're going to look at section 205-603, which is the list of synthetic substances which are allowed for use in organic livestock production. So as with all of the other lists, there are additional restrictions for how some of these materials can be used on organic livestock, including extended milk withholding and some products which are not allowed for use in organic slaughter stock. So some of these synthetics which are allowed include some disinfectants, which include ethanol, isopropanol, chlorine materials, hydrogen peroxide, and iodine. Other synthetics which are allowed are aspirin, vaccines, electrolytes, and flunixin, which is also known as banamine. Continuing on with some of the materials on this list 205-603 of synthetics allowed for livestock production includes glucose, oxytocin, and then three synthetic dewormers or parasiticides, which are ivermectin, fenbendazole, and moxidectin. And these three parasiticides are some of the materials which are highly restricted for use in dairy animals and are actually prohibited for use in organic slaughter stock. Then some surgical materials which are allowed for use include lidocaine and procaine, tolazoline, and xylazine, which are allowed for use for pain relief and surgical procedures. Other allowed synthetics include trace minerals, vitamins, and excipients and inert ingredients, and so these are the non-active ingredients. And again, these are highly restricted and So there are only some non-active ingredients that are allowed in some of these products. And that's why just looking at this list of synthetic substances allowed will not always let you know which brand name products that you can use, and it will take some more in-depth study to really understand which products can be and cannot be used for use. So then we're going to move on to a much shorter list. 205-604 is the list of non-synthetic substances which are prohibited for use in organic livestock production. And at this point, the only thing on this list is strychnine. And again, this is just an overview of the organic standards. There is a lot more information in here that we don't have time to get to in detail. And so I'm mentioning that some of the other national lists are 205-605 and 205-606. And these are lists relating to the ingredients that are allowed and prohibited in processed organic products. And then 205-607 goes into the detail of how these national lists can be amended. And since this really is just an overview of the organic standards, I want to mention all of these additional resources where you can go to learn more about the organic standards.